This has become the defining moment of the 21st century, and these images are among the most famous and shocking ever taken. But at the time, no one realized that a second phase of the tragedy would soon happen. The complete collapse of the towers. A total of 2,818 people died. In a documentary first broadcast last December, many of the reasons for the collapse were uncovered. But since then, disturbing new evidence has come to light.
I think the building was a death trap for a lot of reasons.
It's very tough. I mean, it just deepens the tragedy of that day, that some of the elements could be predicted in advance, and we could have done something about them.
This isn't just an aesthetic thing. This is designed to protect people's lives.
While no one doubts the blame for the tragedy lies squarely with the terrorists who caused it, it now seems that at least some of the loss of life could have been prevented before one of the world's premier buildings was reduced to this. Within days of the collapse, the steel skeleton of the two gigantic towers began arriving in this New Jersey scrapyard. As each piece was brought from Lower Manhattan, huge grappling machines struggled to cope with lumps of metal that weighed over twice as much as the trucks used to transport them. The very ground shook as they fell just a few feet. Within weeks, thousands of tons of high-strength steel lay in massive, twisted heaps. Most of the steel was quickly cut up and exported to the Far East, sold for $120 per ton. And these days, the yard stands almost empty, which for many of the relatives of those who perished is a cause for concern.
We want to know why the buildings collapsed, why they collapsed, how they collapsed, and we want to make sure that this never happens again. And we really don't know how we can ascertain that with most of the evidence lost.
Sally Regenhardt lost her son, Christian, a probationary fireman who had just finished his training, while Rich Gabriel worked for an insurance company in the South Tower. Injured in the impact, he was unable to escape before the building collapsed.
The legacy that we will leave for our loved ones is the changes that we're going to make. Never again will buildings like this be built if we can help it.
What's left of the towers will form the basis of an official investigation, although it's not clear how complete such a study could be. This was the largest structural failure ever witnessed, and the hope is that lessons can be learnt for the future. The structural engineer who built the towers has his office here in Lower Manhattan. It used to have a commanding view of the complex, but now it overlooks what has come to be known as Ground Zero.
The responsibility for arriving, if you will, at the ultimate strength of the tower was mine. And the fact that they didn't stand longer could be laid at my feet. Do I feel guilty about it, about the fact that they collapsed? The circumstances on the 11th of September were outside of that which we considered in the design. Today, if I knew then what I know now, they would have stood longer, of course.
Leslie Robertson was just 34 years old when he started work on a project that would win many awards. Cutting-edge technology applied on an enormous scale. The towers were not to be normal skyscrapers. They were to be innovative in almost every way. They were to have more office space than the entire city of Liverpool, taller than anything ever built. Conceived in the optimistic, forward-looking 1960s as the perfect solution to a problem that badly affected New York, inner city stagnation and decay.
It was a classic American response to a problem, which is hit it right down the middle with as much firepower as you can give it. It was just whammo, the two biggest skyscrapers in the world, clearing away blocks of lower Manhattan. Well, that was going to fix everything, right? That's how we thought in the 1960s.
Back then, the man in charge was Guy Tazzoli, who 31 years later saw the towers fall as he drove to work.
Honestly, I never thought the towers would collapse. It just never occurred to me. They had stood there since 1970 when we opened, and it just didn't seem possible. I remember I cried sitting in the car.
In happier times, Mr. T, as he was known to his staff, was in charge of what the Reader's Digest called the biggest building project since the pyramids.
My job was to make a program which the architects would follow. How many feet of office space, how many feet of consumer service area, a place for customs, a hotel, and then to find the architectural team that could carry it out.
The architect was to be Minoru Yamasaki, or Yama as he was known, a Japanese-American who died in 1986. He conceived of a pair of 80-story towers sprouting from a huge open plaza. But even these giants would not have enough office space for Mr. T.
I said, well, does it meet our program? No, he said, it's not. It's 2 million square feet short. Well, I said, why is that? Well, he said, you can't build a building taller than 80 floors. And I said, why? Well, he said, because the elevatoring in buildings taller than 80 floors make it impossible to be rentable.
The problem was that with a building over 80 stories tall, so much of the lower floors are full of the elevators needed to service the upper floors that the building becomes uneconomic. But this little problem wasn't going to stop Guy Tazzoli.
And I remember saying to Yama, President Kennedy is going to put a man on the moon. I think you could build us the tallest buildings in the world.
The problem was solved by treating each third of the skyscraper as a separate 40-story building, so fewer elevator shafts would be needed. Repeated 3 times, this system was then linked together with 2 express elevators that were the only ones that would go the whole height of the building.
If you went to an upper floor of the World Trade Center, you didn't get in the elevator at the ground floor and go to your floor. You got into a big, giant elevator to what was called a sky lobby, and there you switched for a local elevator to your individual floor. That's what they did, and that's how the buildings happened.
It was now economically viable to construct towers so tall they would face a new challenge: the wind that can sometimes reach hurricane force in New York City. Dealing with gales such as these required yet more innovation.
Most skyscrapers are built on steel or concrete frames, which is a grid of columns and beams that goes all the way through the building. The World Trade Center was different. It was what engineers call a tube structure. It was a very, very strong mesh of steel that surrounded the exterior.
The way in which the walls were built was equally ingenious. 3 30-foot-long columns were welded together off-site to make a relatively lightweight yet rigid prefabricated panel. This was then hoisted up to join thousands of similar pieces, forming a square tube of metal 1/4 mile high. In the middle stood a central core containing all the stairwells and elevator shafts, and giving the towers one of their major selling points: large open floor spaces of nearly an acre each.
Tenants like open space. It's flexible. It allows them to have big open rooms if they want, or to put temporary partitions anywhere they please.
There was another advantage to this system. It would save money.
You could do a tube structure with roughly half the amount of steel than you would need for a conventional frame that goes all the way through the structure, but it would hold up just as well. It would be just as strong.
The construction progressed at an amazing rate, 3 floors every 2 weeks. Steel came from all over America and beyond, arriving just in time to be hoisted to its new home in the sky. The pressure to get the job done was enormous, and supervising it all was an extremely busy Guy Tozzoli.
Well, the first thing I did is I scheduled meetings of 17 minutes. That was the maximum you could have my time. And I took it religiously that way. And you got an answer. That was very important. Because if anything was delayed, $1 million a day to stop this project. And it had to be done on time.
The final job was to place a 350-ton TV antenna on the top of the North Tower, taking its total height to 1,719 feet, which made it, for a brief while, the tallest building on Earth. The Twin Towers, as they quickly became known, now soared above the New York skyline, becoming one of the most famous structures in the world. An instantly recognizable symbol of America itself, a demonstration of high technology coupled with breathtaking ambition. To begin with, it proved difficult to find enough tenants to occupy the huge amount of space the building offered, but gradually the floors filled up, and 23 years passed uneventfully, save for the odd small office fire or jammed elevator. Such high towers made for an exceptional viewing platform, and they were a firm favorite with the tourists.
It's hard to be down when you're up on top of the world. So come on up, take a good look around, have some fun at the top of the world.
The observation deck at the top of the World Trade Center. If you think the view from inside is spectacular, wait till you get outside to the roof. It's breathtaking.
Have some fun at the top of the world.
On February the 26th, 1993, the first terrorist attack took place. A hired van packed with hydrogen canisters and the equivalent of half a ton of TNT was driven into the underground car park beneath the complex. Although there was no vehicle access actually inside the towers themselves, the bombers got as close as they could, parking the van 2 floors down, 6 feet from the subterranean south wall of the North Tower. At 18 minutes past 12, the van exploded. Six people were killed and 1,042 injured in what was, at that time, the biggest terrorist attack ever carried out on American soil. The towers acted like giant chimneys, sucking smoke from the blast upwards through the stairwells and elevator shafts, which were full of people trying to get out. The intention had been to demolish the base of the North Tower and cause it to fall into the south, but the terrorists had not reckoned with the extraordinary strength of the tube of steel.
The bomb was a serious bomb, but in terms of a building of the scale of the World Trade Center, it was not a significant event in terms of the tower. Now, outside of the tower, it was another matter completely.
The bomb failed to demolish the towers because it exploded outside of the tube wall, the blast merely bouncing off and shattering several floors of the car park and a machinery space below that. The next time the terrorists attacked, the outcome would be different because 8 years later, they finally managed to penetrate the tower's defenses. British-born naval architect George Slay was on the 91st floor of the North Tower at 8:46 a.m.
I was on the phone, I heard a roar, looked out the window and saw his passenger jet coming towards the building. It was only about 2 or 3 plane lengths away from me at that point, and I didn't really have time to react. It was just, I saw it and then it was into the building.
George's office was just feet below the point at which nearly 200 tons of Boeing 767 had struck the tower.
Our offices are between the 2 arrowheads, and my office was particularly to the first 3 windows to the right of this arrowhead, in this area here. It doesn't get much closer than that. My office kind of collapsed around me. One of my colleagues came rushing along to see if I was okay and offered to drag me out. I politely refused. I said I was okay and crawled out myself.
At 6 minutes past 9, as onlookers watched in horror, the second plane hit. Watching from the window overlooking the complex was the engineer Leslie Robertson's wife, Sortine C., who is also a structural engineer with the firm.
Well, after the first tower was hit, all of us were gathered around the windows on the north side looking towards the North Tower, which was burning, and I was standing by this window with lots of other people from the office when we saw this blue and red plane coming by and smashed into the South Tower. And people thought it was a movie. You know, it was unreal. We were so stunned. Nobody believed that this was for real.
In the time that has passed since that appalling day, the complete set of plans and drawings that are kept in this office has been under intense scrutiny. These documents graphically illustrate why many in the building would not escape.
These are the architectural drawings of the World Trade Center North Tower, Tower A. And this is the 94th floor, which is very close to the floors of impact on the North Tower. And the plane came in from the north side, so broadside onto the core. The core is from here to here, and from there to there.
If an outline of a Boeing 767 is superimposed on the plans, the true scale of the impact becomes all too clear. The central core's walls were made of a lightweight board called sheetrock, which could offer little protection to the vital stairwells and elevator shafts it contained.
I think talking to some of the other people in our office, when we first went into the stairwell, the people who investigated the stairwells looked up and they could see that the stairwells were blocked above us. There didn't seem to be, there's a lot of debris there, and there was nobody coming down from floors above us.
Many of the elevator shafts were also severed. Lift operator Kelly Badillo was in the North Tower when the first plane hit.
I think one of the elevators, the lower ones, I think the cables broke or something, because they just came flying down, boom. You could hear them. You could hear a lot of the elevators, and then you could hear the wind, like a wind tunnel. But a lot of the elevators came crashing down. Doors flying right open, boom, hitting the other side of the wall and everything.
Standing in the lobby, Kelly witnessed the destruction of the very system that had made the buildings possible in the first place.
One of them flew open, and then people started coming out that elevator, and they had their hair was on fire. You could see the smoke coming off their jackets and everything. And they just kept on running. Once they got out of the everybody just kept on running.
In the North Tower, 1,360 people died above the point of impact. No one escaped through the damaged zone.
It's really tragic, you know, when somebody loses a colleague, a husband, a son, or whatever, to explain to them that they died because of defects that we knew about before the incident.
Jake Pauls is an expert on escape from high-rise buildings. He studied the towers after the bomb in '93 and believes that the stairwell design was misconceived.
One thing we see is the stairs are very tightly clustered together relative, for example, to the diagonal dimension. There's a traditional rule that says that the stairs should be at least half or a third of the diagonal apart, and we can see here they're actually much too close. This was a poor design in terms of the layout of the stairs because there wasn't enough redundancy. For example, so if an incident affects one stair, blocks one stair, it's very likely to affect the other stairs.
Message received September 11th at 8:59 a.m.
Hey Beverly, this is Sean. In case you get this message, there's been an explosion in World Trade 1. That's the other building. It looks like a plane struck it. It's on fire at about the 90th floor, and it's horrible.
Sean Eckert worked on the 98th floor of the South Tower. Before the second plane struck, he had already begun to leave, but was told to go back to his desk.
When the plane hit the first building, the manager of his floor began an immediate evacuation. They headed for what I've since learned would have been staircase C, and at some point in that process, an announcement came telling them that the building was secure and that they should go back to their offices.
No one knew a second plane was about to hit, and when it did, one chance to escape had already been missed. Half an hour later, Beverly spoke to her husband on the phone.
And he said, "Well, we're trapped. We tried to go down. We got as far as I think he said 79, and he said that we couldn't get down any farther, so we tried to go up, and he said the doors are locked."
Many believed that they could be rescued from above by helicopter, but in fact, heavy smoke and obstructions on the roof made it impossible.
Sometime after the 93 bombings, they had cluttered the rooftops with all kinds of equipments and barriers purposely to prevent helicopters from landing on the buildings. And they never told the people who worked there.
In fact, one stairwell, Stairwell A, did remain open in the South Tower. It ran outside the central core to bypass some heavy machinery. Trying to get to the roof had wasted precious time that could have been spent finding the way out.
So, in a life and death situation, they were working with misinformation. They would have looked for another staircase. There's no doubt in my mind that they would have said, okay, where are the other staircases located? And we've got to find them and we've got to get out. And it turns out that staircase A in that building was clear.
Only 18 people found the escape route. Sean Eckert died along with 600 others in the South Tower. It now seems that at least some of those lives could have been saved. As the awful sight was beamed around the world, it seemed incredible that the buildings could stand at all. The truth was that the designers had considered just such a dreadful possibility, taking as their example the Boeing 707 passenger jet.
The airplane we were envisioning was the largest airplane of its time, flying slowly and low, lost in the fog. In any event, we designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
The Boeing 767 is similar in size to the 707, but the hijacked planes were not traveling slowly. They were near to their maximum speed.
The energy contained in an airplane or any other moving object is proportional to the square of the velocity. Double the velocity and you have 4 times the energy. And so the energy imposed on the building by the 767 was very substantially more than the energy that we had assumed in design.
The fact that the buildings stood at all is a testament to their extraordinary strength. But both were now severely damaged, and in very different ways. In the North Tower, the plane had punched its way through approximately 36 of the exterior columns. But it was the core that absorbed the brunt of the energy from the attack. The South Tower was even worse off, since it had been struck lower down and across one corner. This meant that not only was there more weight above the damaged area, putting it under much more stress, but also, because the damage was off-center, the upper section was now trying to lean to one side. The next phase of the tragedy would unpick what little strength was left.
These were the biggest buildings in New York City. Each floor was one acre in area, and we're looking at this, and we see smoke issuing under pressure for at least the top 20 floors, maybe more. So you're looking at, if we're using the 20-floor figure, you're looking at 20 acres of fire.
Although an aircraft impact had been imagined, it seems no one had calculated the effects of fuel on the structure.
To the best of my knowledge, the considerations of the fuel in the airplane in terms of an explosion or a great fire was not considered. Now, we were not responsible for that aspect of the design, so maybe I'm wrong, but I believe it was not considered, and further I believe that had it been considered, it would have been proven to be impossible to deal with it.
Simulations show that the initial fireballs consumed only a fraction of the 10,000 gallons of kerosene fuel each aircraft carried, leaving a substantial quantity to start fires throughout the building. Kerosene burns very quickly, and within about 10 minutes, the flames were being sustained by the normal contents of the buildings. By analyzing the size and speed of the smoke plume, seen here from 250 miles up in space, it was deduced that each fire generated the same energy as a meteor. Down below, hundreds of firefighters arrived at the scene, although in reality, the sheer scale of the towers meant there was very little they could do.
A typical firefighting hose team can extinguish approximately 2,500 square feet. That's an area 25 by 100. If you get two attack hose lines side by side, they may be able to extinguish about 5,000 square feet of fire. The World Trade Center floor areas were 40,000 square feet. They're building these high-rise office buildings with open floor design and creating spaces almost 10 times more than the area we can extinguish with hose streams.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burnt to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its type ever carried out, and it showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is usual in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
So what was the cause of the devastating explosive failure that happened at the World Trade Center? How did such a massively strong steel building suddenly give way and come crashing down to Earth?
I couldn't believe that actually it collapsed like the way it did. Like everyone else, it was totally out of your human capacity to digest it and absorb it. I was shocked as anyone else.
Professor Hassan Astaneh was one of the few scientists to have examined the steel in the New Jersey yard before it was sold abroad for scrap. Here, amongst the ruins, he studied the columns in an attempt to discover what the collapse mechanism could have been. There were several clues that immediately pointed to a very specific and unusual scenario.
What you see here is actually very critical, very, very important. Perhaps this is the most important piece I have found so far. This piece comes from most likely Tower 2, where the plane went in and exploded. This is the inside face of back columns. So plane went in, exploded right here, and the explosion hit this surface. What you see here is, first of all, a bend that is due to explosion, but more importantly, this is a signature of explosion here. This has happened due to explosive material hitting this column and making that bulge. So this is the floor where explosion happened. And the windows are blown away, everything is burned, even fireproofing on this floor is burned and glazed to the steel.
The fireproofing in the World Trade Center was sprayed on, a dry, fragile material made of mineral fibers. Designed to protect the steel from heat, it played a crucial role in the durability of the structure. But there is evidence that at least in some areas, it failed to do its job.
This piece, as you can see, has been burned. You can see the smoke and the fire effect on it. You can see some fireproofing, but really not much of it is left. So you can see that when the building was burning, there was no fireproofing left.
Any lack of fireproofing would have meant that the steel was extremely vulnerable to the heat from the fires, and it seems that in the South Tower particularly, this may have had a disastrous effect on the support for the massive open-plan floors. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Professor Eduardo Causel has been carrying out research into the disaster.
It is always easy to play the general after the war. However, it is important to understand why it is that the structures fell. And if the structures did have an Achilles heel, I believe that this Achilles heel were the floors.
The floor system was unusual for a high-rise building. Instead of the thick steel beams that are normally used, the floors were supported with lightweight structures called trusses. A steel deck was placed over them to form prefabricated panels, which were then hoisted into position. They were fastened at each end to brackets welded to the wall, and once in place, each floor was covered with a 4-inch layer of concrete. This system was one of the reasons the towers could be built so quickly, since each floor was largely pre-assembled down on the ground. But the drawback with such lightweight trusses is that they can be very susceptible to fire.
There is no other construction technique that has killed more firefighters than trusses. We have a saying in the fire service, don't trust the truss. They fail during fire.
A truss's strength depends on each and every beam and bar it contains. Damage even a small part of it, and the whole system fails.
Here we have a model of the floor system with the floors and the beams, the trusses. This system is very strong, is very light, very stiff, but it is also very susceptible to fire. And therefore it has to be fireproofed very well and appropriately. To demonstrate this, I have here a similar floor system that has been fireproofed everywhere except at these 2 locations here, and we will see what effect these elements can have on the behavior of the structure.
First, the load on the floor is simulated with metal weights, and then the system is heated up with a gas burner. Almost immediately, the unprotected elements fail, compromising the strength of the entire unit.
This demonstrates that the structure is only as strong as the weakest link. This element that fails, even if it is only slightly exposed, is the one that determines how strong the structure will be.
Even though most of the truss remains as strong as ever, the failed section pulls inwards, putting enormous loads on the connections at each end, which, if not properly protected, would also be weakened by the fire. A theory reinforced by the findings made in the scrapyard.
You cannot bend the steel like this without cracking it, unless you warm it up. So what this piece tells me is that this piece was very hot when the floor collapsed and bent it. So that must have been the initiation of collapse of this World Trade Center tower.
So what happened to the fireproofing? Why, as appears, was it so ineffectual? It's been speculated that the blast from the impacts must have removed it, but there is another explanation, one that suggests that maybe the towers should have stood for longer than they did. The fireproofing had actually had a rather checkered history. In 1995, a bitter court case took place about asbestos in the sprayed-on material, and consultant architect Roger Morse was asked to examine it. What he found greatly disturbed him.
The fireproofing on the tenant floors, on the trusses, was missing in many locations. It was thin in virtually all locations. The fireproofing on the columns in the core was falling off of the columns in story-high sheets.
These photographs, taken in the mid-90s, show the state of the fire protection in at least some of the building. Few places show a 1.5-inch thick coating, the amount required to adequately safeguard the steel.
You can see that the fireproofing is missing from the diagonal. This is the diagonal that's going to the end point where the truss is sitting on the outside column.
Although he only examined the lower floors of the North Tower, Roger Morse's photos show that at the time the building was less than comprehensively protected. Many of the vital connections on which the floors depended were almost bare.
If this were the proper thickness of fireproofing, this would be an amorphous blob of fireproofing material. The space behind this angle seat would be completely filled with fireproofing. I don't know what happened. The applicator didn't install it properly. It wasn't inspected properly. Somehow or another, the fireproofing guy was allowed to take a pass on this, which is really quite an outrageous thing when you consider the importance of what's going on.
In the central core, the reason the column's protection was in such bad condition was easier to explain.
What had happened was that the fireproofing was applied to loose rust that hadn't been cleaned off the steel at the time the fireproofing was applied. So the fireproofing was stuck just fine to the rust, but the rust was coming loose from the steel, so the fireproofing would fall off with it.
Those responsible have stated that the maintenance of the fireproofing was an ongoing headache, but that the buildings were safe. The floor trusses at the impact point of the North Tower had been refurbished in the last few years of the building's life, but they had only got as far as recoating one of the impacted floors in the South Tower. They also contend that the impacts were so severe and the damage so great that the collapse was inevitable. This view is disputed by Roger Morse.
The fireproofing had been in good condition. If it had been installed properly and had been maintained properly, then the buildings certainly would have survived longer and may even have survived altogether. May never have collapsed.
Whatever the true performance of the fireproofing, the last phase of the destruction was now underway, for the design meant that with large parts of the floors removed, the entire tower would fall. Again, the principle is easy to demonstrate.
Here we have two models. These two structures are identical except that this one here is missing an intermediate floor, and we shall see what effect this floor has on the way that the structures carry weights. I'm going to be loading first the structure on this side. The important thing to keep in mind is that these loads are transferred through the columns to the table, and that this intermediate floor carries none of this load. All it does, this floor, is it ties the columns together and it provides stability to the columns.
The model on the left is easily able to take a very large load.
And I could add more weight like this one here. perfectly stable. Let's begin removing weights and adding them onto the structure on the other side.
If the one with the missing floor is tried, it cannot support nearly as much. Without the stabilizing effect of the floor, its columns twist and buckle, and it collapses. The south tower burned for 56 minutes before it fell. Its less adequately fireproofed floor trusses unable to brace the vertical columns and keep them from buckling under the immense gravitational load. While lower Manhattan was smothered in a filthy, choking dust, the fire continued to eat away at the strength of the North Tower. It had stood for longer because it had been hit square on, and so could better redistribute the loads. It also had less weight above the point of impact, and its floor trusses were better protected. But the fire would seek out the weakest part nevertheless, and this time the core columns would give way first. Once the top of the building had fallen just the height of a single story, its vast momentum smashed each floor in turn, until all 500,000 tons of steel hit the ground at 120 miles per hour. The Twin Towers were once a symbol of prosperity and optimism, built when America had little fear of terrorist attack. It now seems as if they will be remembered for a very different reason.
This building, the way it was constructed, was innovative, but it nevertheless resulted in the most catastrophic building collapse there has ever been. But I just hope that my husband's death is not meaningless, that lessons are learned from this event, and that things change.